There's a man lying lifeless on the palace floor. A deep red pool spreads across the luxurious marble. Moments ago, this man was murdered. Stunned onlookers gather. Some weep, some pray, for this was no ordinary man. Philip II is dead. Philip brought Macedon from a poor borderland to a proud empire, stretching from the hills of Paeonia to the pass of Thermopylae. Just 40 years ago, it was a poor collection of tribes, but it had potential. All Macedon needed was a leader, and then that leader arrived. In 382 BC, Philip, son of King Amnitas, was born. Being the youngest of 3 sons, he never expected to be king, spending the first 12 years of life engrossed in his studies. He watched his 2 older brothers being prepared for the danger of the throne, but during these years, the nation thrived under his father's bold leadership. He crushed the northern tribes and formed strong bonds with Athens. Amnitas was probably the best king Macedon had had in decades. But then he died. Philip's oldest brother Alexander II was next in line, but the nobles didn't want a peaceful transition. They wanted another weak king they could control. Seeing the opportunity, Pausanias revolted in the east. The nobles quickly rose funds for his march on the capital. This is a pattern that had repeated across all of Macedonian history. Macedon didn't have the luxury of safe neighbors. Succession was always a struggle. If Alexander didn't act quickly, Macedon wouldn't live to see another day. Most of his new armies were tied down in the far west, dealing with Illyrian invasions. He decided to empty the treasury and gather troops as he marched east. Athens would pledge a local regiment to aid him, and Thebes would fund his efforts against the rebels. With 1 army quickly approaching and 2 preparing to march, Pausanias fled across the border into Thrace. Macedon was now firmly under Alexander II. Down south in Thessaly, a brutal civil war had broken out between the rival cities of Larissa and Pharsalus. This war had been simmering in the background during the revolt of Pausanias, but it now had its time to shine. The 2 sides were evenly matched. If this war continued any longer, Thessaly would be dragged into even deeper destruction. Larissa moved first, calling on the newly unified Macedon to intervene. The Macedonian army was exhausted, but Alexander saw a chance to expand. They would march south to aid the Larissans, before betraying them and taking their land for Macedon. The army reached Larissa without trouble, but once they entered the fortified walls, they marched straight to the city center. Once they reached the Acropolis, Alexander II crowned himself king and ordered his army to seize key points around the city. Now it was clear as day. Macedon wasn't here to help. They were here to invade. The Thessalians acted quickly and sent a messenger to Thebes warning them of Macedon's invasion. Once the messenger arrived at the Senate building, he gave the Thebans a letter explaining their dire situation. The news stunned the Theban council. For many years, Thessaly had served as a happy buffer between Macedon and Thebes. This overreach trampled all over that unspoken agreement. Their response needed to be crystal clear. Thessalian independence is non-negotiable. In dire moments like these, there was only one group of men the city could count on. The sacred band of Thebes, the best soldiers in all of Greece, fresh off victory against the Spartans last autumn. To head this elite army, it was only fitting that Thebes sent their best. Theban statesman and general Pelopides, the man who had reinstated Theban democracy and led them to victory ever since. Thebes had just assembled the dream team. Macedon was in for a fight. Back in Thessaly, Alexander II continued to collect control of his new cities, unaware of the events unfolding in Thebes. This prompted Athens to cut ties, leaving him isolated. Just 100 kilometers south, his fate was already sealed. The Theban dream team was ready to march. For 5 days, Greece held its breath waiting for the battle. Alexander II tried to withdraw back to Macedon, but the Thebans reached him on the plains north of Larissa. Now forced into battle, he turned his army, hoping his larger numbers would scare them off. The Thebans looked straight back at him. His intimidation wasn't going to work. On cue, Pelopides' scouts moved out of the forest, blocking Alexander's one way out. Finally, he caved. He gave up all claims to Thessaly, promised to never return, and was forced to recognize Thebes' authority over the region. As collateral for these promises, he would send his 13-year-old brother Philip to Thebes for his education. In return, he would be allowed to leave Thessaly with his life. He returned to Macedon a humiliated man, begging for mercy to a foreign power. He kept his promise, and Philip was sent to be taught by the very man who had just destroyed him. Alexander II would spend the rest of his reign the laughingstock of Greece. He would be killed by assassins just a year later. Philip reached Thebes in the spring of 369 BC. He was greeted by Pelopidas and quickly enlisted in the Theban army. He was trained in strategy, politics, diplomacy, and philosophy. You name it, Pelopidas taught it. As Macedon slipped further into chaos, Philip was carefully calculating every move far into the future, a skill that his brother had lacked back in Larissa. He learned how to take calculated risks and how to position yourself above the crowd. Above all, Pelopidas was teaching the art of winning, and he had no better student than Philip. Back in Macedon, Philip's older brother Perdiccas had rebelled against the nobles and had won back control of his country. He immediately faced a massive Illyrian invasion. An army was formed to counter them, but they were decisively defeated, and Perdiccas was killed in battle. Facing internal collapse, Philip was released by Thebes to bring Macedon back under order. By the time he arrived in the capital, the situation had become critical. The Paeonians and Thracians had marched into eastern Macedon to support the Illyrian invasion. To make matters worse, Athens had occupied many cities along the coast and was preparing to march on Pelis to replace Philip. He now faced 4 enemies. The kings before him couldn't even handle one. Macedon couldn't afford another average leader. They needed a hero. Amnitas faded, Alexander II was humiliated, and Perdiccas paid with his life. This job had wiped out Philip's whole family. Now it was his turn. Macedon either died here or rose to empire. Philip wasted no time. He quickly mobilized every fighting man in Macedon and trained them with the state-of-the-art tactics he had learned in Thebes. To buy time, he sent gifts to the Paeonians and Thracians to leave his territory. It wouldn't be the last they heard of him. He then elevated a man out of minor nobility to help lead this new army, Parmenion, who had proved himself capable under Philip's earlier brothers. Now with a fully trained army, he marched against the Illyrians under the 90-year-old king Bardalus. But messengers arrived from the north with great news. The Paeonian king Agis had died. The opportunistic Philip pivoted north to meet the now leaderless Paeonian. He looted their land and retrieved his bribes, before installing a puppet king and leaving. After he secured his northern border, Philip continued east to throw the Illyrians out of Macedon. The two sides met on the plains of the Aragon Valley, both even at around 10,000 troops. Both armies positioned their infantry in the center, with cavalry on the wing. Same numbers, same position. This would be a battle of nerves. The Illyrians moved first, marching into the Macedonian line, expecting them to break. Philip's soldiers held. They weren't fighting the old Macedon anymore. The Macedonians fought fiercely, but their right began to buckle under the pressure. Philip rushed out and took personal control of these cohorts. Their training was awakened and they held their line. Then, the exhausted Illyrian cavalry on the right fell back into the center. They finally buckled and fled the field. Now with the right fleeing, the army's morale broke and withdrew into the hills. Bardalus was killed in the fighting, and his armies fell back into the wilderness. In one summer, Philip had expelled 3 of 4 threats and had delivered a crippling defeat to the Illyrians. To fortify these gains, he married Bardalus's granddaughter and conquered the lands for Macedon. He and his army returned home for winter training. Next spring, the Athenians would have their turn. During that winter, they had sent Argaeus and 4,000 hoplites to secure their coastal cities. For the whole winter, they had jumped around the North Aegean, raiding and capturing different Macedonian cities. Now with the arrival of spring, Philip was ready to force an engagement. He found his opportunity in the eastern city of Amphipolis. Argaeus and his hoplites were marching east to capture the key city. But Philip didn't march out to fight them. He realized that the only reason Athens even supported Argaeus' expedition was to retake the key gold mines around the region. If Philip just let Argaeus take the city, Athens would have no reason to support him anymore. Against the will of his rank and file, he pulled the Macedonian garrison out of the city and gave it up. Argaeus was cutting his only lifeline. Why would Philip stop him? Just as planned, Amphipolis fell and Athens recalled their hoplites, leaving Argaeus toothless. Luckily for him, a second Athenian army under Mantius had just landed at Methone. Argaeus escaped by the skin of his teeth and fled to the protection of Mantius. Once he reached him, Mantius kept him in Methone, intending to send him back to Athens. Now both of the Athenian commanders, along with 3,000 hoplites, had collected themselves in Methone. If Philip wanted to knock Athens out of Macedon for good, this was the time. It was David versus Goliath. the poor backwater of Macedon versus the cultural titan of Athens. Mantius planned to stay in Methone and wait for further reinforcements, but Argaeus hadn't given up on being a hero. He took control of a section of hoplites and marched into Achaea, proclaiming himself the true king of Macedon. Philip realized that Argaeus' reckless actions had split the Athenians in two. Philip quickly marched into the gap, blocking Argaeus' only way out. He then sent raiders to force him into retreat. Like clockwork, Argaeus marched right into Philip's army, and they were quickly mopped up by Macedon's new elite soldiers. Philip then turned south to bring Mantius the good news. Upon hearing of the destruction of Argaeus' army, the remaining Athenians retreated back across the Aegean. They would never step foot in Macedon again. For years, the Macedonian people were humiliated by the Athenian presence. In one victory, Philip had sent a wave of pride across Macedon. They were the talk of Greece. It's only up from here. Philip's army celebrated in the now freed city, before marching back to Macedon victorious. He then went on a 3-year marriage streak. He married Philaena to secure support from the Macedonian nobles, then Olympia to strengthen peace in Epirus, then Nicepolis and Philaena to expand his influence into Thessaly. He also spent these 3 years of peace further training his armies. Philip's new wife Olympias also gave birth to a son. Philip named him Alexander, but no need to worry, it's not like he'll be great or anything. Now with Macedon's borders secure, Philip could turn his focus to the east. He hadn't forgot about the Thracians and their earlier invasion, but they would need special weapons to fight in the rough wilderness of Thrace. Philip swapped the typical short dory spear and doubled its length, shrinking the shield so both hands could hold it. It's with this newly equipped army that he would march into Amphipolis and take it back. That summer, he and Parmenion marched with an army to Amphipolis. Once they saw Philip's army, the city closed its gates. They then abandoned their neutrality and called on Athens for defense. This was a far more hostile reception than either general expected. Philip calmed Athens' nerves and promised to definitely give Amphipolis back after he captured it. Shockingly, Athens believed this and held back any intervention. Philip quickly put the city under siege. In an attempt to broker a peace, Athens offered to exchange the Athenian colony of Pydna for peace in Amphipolis. Philip skillfully left this offer on the table to discourage any Athenian meddling while the siege continued. But as it dragged on, multiple cities on the Chalcadian peninsula banded together to resist Philip's eastward expansion. They requested an Athenian garrison, but Athens remained hopeful of Macedon returning Amphipolis. After the city finally fell, Philip could turn his attention to this new league. Athens had fallen into revolt and would be unable to intervene in Macedonian affairs for the time being. This was great news. Philip was now the only major power in northern Greece, and he would have free reign until the Athenians sorted out their rebels. But Philip didn't need another war. He met with the Chalcadian city-states and negotiated a settlement. The Chalcadian League would enter into an alliance with Macedon. In exchange, Macedon would kick Athens out of Podia and hand the city over to the League. Philip was finally positioned to kick Athens out of the North Aegean for good. He then moved to Podia, where he kept his word and handed the city over to the Chalcadians. Now he could finally secure the gold mines around Amphipolis. He sacked 2 cities before the weakened Thracians came to a peace and gave him what he wanted. Look back on all those achievements. All that in just 5 years. That's what greatness looks like, and all of Greece knew it. But while Philip was racing around Greece expanding his empire, things had escalated severely in Thessaly. The city of Thebes had used their position as the head of the Temple of Apollo to impose great religious fines on the Phocians, claiming that they were farming on sacred land. Make no mistake, this was just an excuse to go to war. The Phocians refused the fine and seized the sacred temple at Delphi. The Athenians and Spartans sided with the Phocians, as did most of Thessaly, but then they started plundering the temple treasury. Even if the original charges were lies, it was definitely not holy to dig through the treasury for personal gain. Just like that, Athens and Sparta withdrew their support. Now it was only the Thessalians. Thebes declared a sacred war against them and began forming an army. They called on Macedon to help them intervene in Greek affairs. We've seen this story before, and so had Philip. His older brother was crushed doing just the same thing. Thessaly had a reputation for chewing up anyone who entered unprepared. But Philip saw the power vacuum, and he wanted Thessaly. Philip's army was to turn the tides of war and march south. the Thessalians sent a 7,000-strong cohort to halt their advance. Philip caught these forces after a long day's march and brushed them aside with relative ease. Seeing the worsening situation to their north, the Thessalian army would bring their full force against Philip. Philip was now heavily outnumbered and deep in enemy territory. He set his army up on open plain. There was a hill in the distance, but it was way too far for spearmen. The Thessalian forces matched him along the open plain, both sides readied for battle. But unexpectedly, the Thessalian forces started moving back. Not wanting to let them slip away, Philip moved his army forward to match them. This continued until the Macedonian army was in firing range of the hill. Then a signal was given. Massive catapults revealed themselves on the hill and fired straight into the Macedonian line. The Thessalians charged into the scattered army. It didn't matter how disciplined they were. If giant rocks are falling on your head, you're gonna run. The Macedonian line collapsed. It was every man for himself. The cavalry charged into the fleeing Macedonians and picked off the stragglers. It was a complete rout. The army chased them back across the border. The rolling hills of Thessaly had claimed another victim. Philip collected what remained of his army and told them to keep the whole crushing defeat thing on the down low. He marched into Pelis that winter claiming that he, quote, did not run away, but like a ram, pulled back again to hit harder. Still, it wasn't lost on anyone that the so-called ram was missing half his army. The statement did have a portion of truth to it though. Philip wasn't going to sit back and take such a nasty loss. He spent that whole winter preparing for a second campaign in Thessaly. Whether or not it would hit again harder was still a worry. Soon spring arrived, and Philip had mustered 23,000 men. He quickly swept south, occupying much of Thessaly's cities, but they had mobilized to meet him. He quickly moved to cut off their sea access, and took the port of Pegasae. He needed to move fast. The Athenians were on their way to reinforce the Thessalian army. The two sides finally met at Crocus Field, but Philip knew the Thessalian morale was weakening. He quickly got to work putting on quite the show for the opposing army, sending his men into battle wearing crowns of laurel, the symbol of Apollo. The imagery was clear. Philip was fighting for the gods. Some of the more religious Thessalians threw down their arms and joined Philip's side. Philip then led a full charge against the demoralized line. They quickly broke and fled back to their navy. They suffered heavy losses along the way, and Philip had basically won the battle by putting on an amateur theater show. Once the Athenians heard of the defeat, they turned back to Thermopylae. The remaining city-states quickly pledged their loyalty and named Philip king. He had done the impossible. He had conquered Thessaly. But the war wasn't done just yet. The Athenian politician Demosthenes was whipping up a storm, calling Philip a tyrant and rallying the army for a last stand at Thermopylae. During this time, Philip was busy building up a new government in Thessaly, but once he got word of Demosthenes' fiery statements, he immediately set out to meet him. He marched into the pass of Thermopylae to force Demosthenes to back down. Once Philip's army reached him, Demosthenes barraged him with a series of emboldened speeches, accusing him of war crimes during the fall of Amphipolis, and calling for all of Greece to rise against Philip. As the standoff dragged on, his attacks grew more personal, calling Philip a coward for not fighting, and ridiculed him for having 7 wives. Philip then shot back, reminding Demosthenes that he only had 1 wife back in Athens, and she had cheated on him with servants. He may have taken it a little too far, but it certainly shut up Demosthenes. Philip then pulled out of the pass and returned to his business in Thessaly, leaving the trusted general Antipater in control of his southern armies. Macedon was officially back at war with Athens. Philip set up a friendly government in Thessaly and took their armies back to Macedon. If Demosthenes would stop him from marching into Athens, he would starve it instead. Philip cut grain imports from Thessaly to Athens, but Athens just switched to buying grain from the fertile Ukrainian steppe. To secure this new critical trade route, Athens entered into alliance with Chersobleptes of Thrace. He gave them control of the straits at the Hellespont. Now that Athens had swung the balance of power, the Chalcidians signed a separate peace deal with them, effectively betraying their Macedonian alliance. Philip now needed to cut the Athenian supply of grain. He asked Chersobleptes for peaceful transfer of his armies through his territories. He rejected the offer and notified the Athenians of the threat. Philip began marching anyway. He marched deep into Thrace and sacked the Thracian treasury. Chersobleptes then surrendered and became a vassal king. It was around this time that Philip fell ill. Hearing of the Thracian defeat, Athens quickly formed a cohort to reinforce their garrison at the Hellespont. But when they learned of Philip's sickness, they assumed he would abandon his campaign and turn back, so they never ended up leaving Athens. Philip was sick, and would return home, but the army would continue east under Parmenion. He quickly reached the Hellespont and kicked the Athenian garrison out. But once Philip arrived back in Macedon, it was clear that 10 years of near constant expansion had taken its toll. Unrest had gripped Macedon in his absence, and now there was an open conspiracy to oust him. Philip's great conquest had gained him sweeping support from the military and common people, but the nobles felt sidelined. Macedon was now richer and more powerful than ever before, and the nobles wanted it for themselves. Philip's brother-in-law was leading the charge, and had been holding open rallies campaigning for him to replace Philip. These people were an open conspiracy when Philip re-entered Pelis. They quickly rushed to explain, but their actions explained more than their words. Philip quickly diverted emergency forces from Illyricum, and gave himself dictatorial powers. He then used the army to surround the city and round up the conspirators. Most were captured and executed, but a sizable amount of them managed to slip past the army checkpoints. Many fled south to the now neutral Chalcadian League. Once Philip secured the capital, he met up with Parmenion returning from the east. They both demanded the League hand over all conspirators. The Chalcadians called for Athenian support. Chalcadia had just rebelled. Once Philip and Parmenion heard of this, they quickly marched into Chalcadia and began burning every city that didn't surrender. They ravaged the region for 3 months. In September, they reached the largest and final city, Olynthos. The Chalcadian elite would make their final stand there, but the will of their army had been broken. They abandoned the city and fled to Athens. Philip burned Olynthos and sold the remaining civilians into slavery. Once the Olynthians reached Athens, public outcry against Philip grew. But the war had raged on for 10 years, and the blockade of the Hellespont was nearly forcing a famine. Philip had played all his cards right, and now was the time for a final blow. He began to march south against Athens. Sparta and Athens set out to meet this threat at Thermopylae, but Philip marched at breakneck speeds. He reached the pass at Thermopylae before the Athenians. Now with the Macedonian army inside southern Greece, the situation was hopeless. Athens sent out Philocrates and Demosthenes as peace envoys out to Philip's camp. But as one final power move, Philip marched just a little bit closer to Athens and held the negotiations there. Demosthenes entered wanting one thing, a promise that Philip would stop any further expansion into Greece. They abandoned all claims to Amphipolis and let the Macedonians execute the original temple raiders. In exchange, Macedon would resume Thessalian grain shipments, but would retain the right to starve Athens anytime they saw fit. These harsh terms were sent back to the Athenian council, but Demosthenes wasn't happy with it. He instructed his supporters to block it from passing. Finally, to end the deadlock, Demosthenes secured a promise from Philip to never expand into southern Greece. This finally swayed the Athenian council into accepting the peace. Philip had entered the sacred war a long-shot rising star. He left it the sole great power in Greece. He returned to Macedon with a reputation. He had now proved himself a brilliant general and strategist. By the time he made it back to Macedon, the people had already been celebrating for a week. Philip paraded through the streets of Pelis triumphantly. His careful diplomacy had brought Macedon to unheard of wealth. They celebrated victory at Methone, Amphipolis, Crocus Fields, and Thermopylae. Philip personally funded 30 days of festivities in the capital. But deep in the forest of Thrace, an alliance was brewing. Many of the local tribes were unhappy with Philip's expanding role in the once wild lands. They planned an organized revolt against the Macedonian vassal state of Consolidating, and to reinstate Thracian independence. While Philip was distracted partying, they had already begun ambushing local Macedonian garrisons and seizing key cities across Thrace. Consolidating was forced out and fled back to Macedon. By the time the news reached Philip, it was too late. Thrace was in full revolt. Philip reorganized his disbanded army and left his 16-year-old son Alexander in charge of Macedon. Philip marched east to defeat the Thracian rebels, expecting one large army. What he found instead was ambush after ambush. Philip took back the main towns of Thrace early, but the rebels overwhelmed any Macedonian garrison they caught. To make matters worse, Corinthos, his only supply hub in the region, had refused to send aid. The campaign dragged on for 3 whole years as Philip trudged around the wilderness trying to chase the tribes down. Finally, in 341 BC, he defeated the last of these tribes and annexed Thrace. Now he could deal with those pesky Corinthians who had made his life a living hell for 3 years. He marched south to force them into surrender, but they had closed their gates and were going to fight. Great. Philip quickly laid siege on the city, but his blockade was patchy. The Persian Empire had begun to take notice of Philip's actions, and was eager to support the Corinthians' defense. They would send food and supplies for as long as the Corinthians needed. Now that his siege was breaking down, Philip ordered siege towers to be built for a final assault. Seeing the imminent attack, the Corinthians appealed to the nearby city of Byzantium for troops. They delivered in strength and sent multiple cohorts as reinforcements. Philip then split off half the army to confront Byzantium. Back in Athens, Demosthenes delivered a series of moving speeches in favor of the Byzantine struggle. They would also send support to Byzantium. Philip rushed to breach the city before the Athenian arrival, but his attacks were held back. Now with his second siege unraveling, Philip decided to go all in. He declared war on Athens and stopped all Thessalian grain shipments. He then used his army near Byzantium to destroy 230 Ukrainian grain ships that had been waiting to cross. He used the wood from these ships to build bigger and better siege engines. He sent them to launch a major attack on Byzantium, which failed miserably. After the failures in Byzantium, Philip regrouped his armies to at least take Corinthos. This also failed. Philip finally gave up on his Hellespont campaign and abandoned the region. He left for Thrace expecting to put down a quick revolt. It turned into a grueling guerrilla warfare campaign. Then he was soundly defeated at the Hellespont and dragged into another unwanted war against Athens. It was clear Philip had overplayed his hand. 342 BC had not been his year. There was some good news waiting for him back home though. His son Alexander had performed remarkably well as governor while he was gone. Alexander had even gone south to repel Athenian raids into Thessaly, where he had shown great success. It was clear that he shared his father's talents for diplomacy and strategy. Philip set out to meet him in Thessaly for a march on Athens. Thebes had been quietly alarmed by Philip's moves for quite some time now, but this was their breaking point. They wouldn't stand for such a large Macedonian army on their doorstep. Thebes would join Athens at Thermopylae to block Philip's entry. Most of southern Greece would join them. Philip advanced south to meet them. He reached Thermopylae hoping to sweep away the combined Greek army in one large attack. He charged all his forces against the pass, but the line held firm. This was looking like it was going to be another long standoff. As a last resort, Philip sent out scouts to each of the harsher passes, not expecting to hear anything back. To his shock, the messengers found a completely undefended pass that could fit an army after a couple days' work. Philip was ecstatic. He immediately got to work carving out a usable passage. Once it was finished, the Macedonian army waited for the cover of night, then quietly dismantled much of their camp and marched past the hills. Philip now had an army inside southern Greece. His play here was simple. Before the coalition knew what was happening, he would march behind them. Then once day broke, they would find themselves surrounded. Philip marched north to meet them, but he was spotted by a coalition patrol. They rushed back to warn their army. The Greek camp was awakened, and now a flurry of activity. Philip was unaware that he had been seen, and continued to march at a leisurely pace. This move gave coalition forces time to fall back south. Once day broke, the Macedonians were left staring at themselves, while the coalition forces had escaped further east. They would make their last stand near the town of Chaeronea. Philip and Alexander marched out to meet them. The coalition was well positioned, on open plains with two mountains to their sides. This would be a head-on battle. Both sides numbered around 30,000 men. Philip was in charge of the far left, and Alexander led the far right. They were opposed by a mix of different Greek city-states on the left. In the center, the Athenians, and on the right, the Thebans and their feared sacred band. Philip's left moved first, charging into the mixed Greek army. They inflicted heavy losses, but the line held. Alexander soon moved in to keep the pressure on the coalition forces. Seeing the exhausted Greeks, Philip began to pull back his left. Alexander followed suit. The Athenian army was confused on which army to follow, so half rushed forward while half stayed back. The Macedonian plan was working perfectly. Alexander recognized the opportunity when he saw it, and quickly took personal control of the cavalry and charged into this gap. The center followed, and advanced on the remaining Athenians and Thebans. Alexander swung against their flank, delivering crushing losses. Soon, all of the center and right would flee. The sacred band fought to the last man, but their fate was inevitable. They too would fall. The Battle of Chaeronea was a sweeping Macedonian victory. In the coming days, they would receive peace envoys from all across Greece. Philip would force all his opponents out of Thebes and install a friendly government. Athens would be left alone as long as they kept their navy. Philip was now in complete control of Greece, and believe me, he had big plans. For years, Aristotle had been campaigning across Greece for a new idea. He had called for all Greeks to put down their weapons and to unite their people into one state. He had given a couple speeches on Panhellenism before, but now with Philip as undisputable leader of Greece, he put his full focus to it. Philip took note of his speeches and invited him for a meeting. They met outside Philip's camp at Chaeronea. Philip was now the only man in Greece capable of forming a united state. Aristotle needed to convince him. Thankfully, the men already knew each other through Aristotle's tutorship of Alexander. Aristotle cautiously congratulated Philip on his victory. Philip laughed. The battle would have been lost if not for Alexander's quick thinking, the same quick thinking that he had learned from Aristotle. As the night grew longer, the conversation drifted into politics and philosophy. It turns out that Philip was a huge fan of Aristotle's work, and had been for quite some time. He invited Aristotle to speak at an upcoming conference of the Greek states. Aristotle gladly accepted his offer, and left the camp ecstatic. He spent his whole life dreaming of a united Greece. He had nearly given up hope on multiple occasions, but now that dream seemed inevitable. Philip invited all the Greek cities to come meet him at a venue in Corinth. The Greek delegates shuffled into the crowded Senate building. Philip announced the creation of a pan-Hellenic league. The crowd grew uneasy at the thought of uniting with Philip. Aristotle rose to speak. History would forget his exact words, but it's clear that he won the delegates over. Philip would spend the coming days ironing out the exact system with the delegates. Once he was done, they met back at the Senate. Members of the League would be forbidden from attacking each other. They would be allowed to keep their local laws. All states would provide soldiers, equipment, and supply to the newly unified Greek army. In peacetime, a council would govern the state, but during wartime, the hegemon would take over. Philip would be the first hegemon. All Greek city-states other than Sparta accepted to this agreement. Philip's first order was to officially declare war on Persia. He ordered all Greek city-states to form an army and to meet back in Athens next year. Philip returned to Macedon a hero. He was the most powerful man in Greece, conqueror of the Paeonians, Thracians, Illyrians, and Thessalians. Philip was on top of the world. He would be dead within a year. He sent Parmenion to build a bridgehead across the Aegean. Once he re-entered Macedon, he kept in contact with him, strategizing on what the terrain looked like and what they would do once Philip joined him. He would never reach Persia. Philip was set to marry off his daughter Cleopatra to the Epirene king. Days of celebration were planned in the old capital of Achaia. All of Greece sent lavish gifts and envoys to prepare. It also served as the final goodbye to Macedon. Philip planned to attack Persia after the festivities ended, but Persia would attack him first. On the second day of celebration, Philip was waiting outside a theater show. The line was moving slowly, and he began to make small talk with the other Greek delegates. Behind him, Philip's bodyguard unsheathed his sword and in one swift action ran it through Philip's chest. Philip stumbled back in shock. The crowd descended on the assassin and executed him on the spot. Philip's mind began to fade as he bled out on the marble, echoes of Aragon Valley and Methone. Behind him, the sounds of celebration collapsed into chaos. The world would never be the same. Philip would take his last breath seconds later. His sun burned with fury, his mind already racing through the lessons his father taught him. The world would soon know his name: Alexander.